Every holiday my husband's parents took over plans, saying, "You'll celebrate when we say so." This time I booked a $12,000 vacation for just us. Their meltdown at the airport was caught on camera. What happened next shocked everyone. I never imagined I'd be standing in the middle of an airport, my face flushed with rage, while a crowd of strangers filmed my in-laws having a public meltdown. The hum of baggage carts and the overhead announcements barely registered over the sound of Elaine's shrill voice, cracked with fury and heartbreak. People were staring, some wide-eyed, others with their phones angled just discreetly enough to capture the scene without getting directly involved. And there I was, staring at my husband Connor, who stood frozen between his sobbing mother and his fuming father. Sweat clung to the back of his neck. His jaw was tight, eyes wild with panic, unsure whether to comfort his mother or pry her off him. I could feel my pulse throbbing in my ears, and when Martin, my father-in-law, pointed at me with a trembling hand and barked, "You did," the weight of years of resentment crashed down all at once.
But I'm getting ahead of myself.
It wasn't always this way. When I met Connor, he was kind, charming, and a little shy. He had this quiet steadiness that made you feel safe, like you could exhale around him. I fell in love with his gentleness, the way he listened with genuine interest, how he held my hand when he knew I was nervous. We married 2 years later in a small ceremony in Vermont, surrounded by close friends and family. Well, my close family. Because by then, I had already realized that Connor's family came in one suffocating, all-consuming package. His parents, Elaine and Martin, weren't just involved, they were omnipresent. At first, it was easy to dismiss. I told myself it was just their way of showing love. Elaine was the doting mother, always calling to check in, asking if we needed anything. And Martin was the protective father, offering advice Connor didn't need and correcting him on things he already knew. But after the wedding, the boundary lines began to blur. Holidays were non-negotiable. By our first Christmas, it was made clear. "You'll celebrate when we say so." That wasn't a suggestion, it was a decree. I still remember that first holiday. I had been so excited to spend it with my parents and siblings at their home in New Hampshire. I pictured sitting by the fire with my dad, drinking bourbon, and listening to my mom's corny jokes, while my sister and I helped with the cooking. But when I mentioned it casually to Elaine, she blinked at me, as if I had spoken in Swahili. "Oh no," she said with a breezy laugh. "Christmas is at our place. Always has been." I opened my mouth to object, but she waved it off. "Next year, maybe," she added with a dismissive little shrug. Connor, of course, caved immediately. "They just want us all together," he mumbled later, when I confronted him. The pattern repeated itself. Thanksgiving? At theirs. Easter? At theirs. New Year's Eve? God forbid we celebrate it with friends. And whenever I suggested breaking the cycle, I was met with tears and guilt. "Your parents have you all the time," Elaine would sigh. "We only have Connor now. Don't take him from us." I bite my tongue every time. But last year was my breaking point. I had spent weeks planning Christmas with my family. My parents rented a cozy cabin up in Lake Tahoe. It was supposed to be magical, crackling fireplaces, snow-covered pines, and steaming mugs of spiked cider. My mom had been knitting personalized Christmas stockings, and my dad, who was getting older, was so excited to have everyone together. I could already imagine walking through the snow with my sister, bundled in scarves, laughing about the terrible boyfriend she had just dumped. I could feel the weight of a heavy quilt on my lap by the fire, but none of that happened. Because 4 days before Christmas, Connor came home with that look on his face, the one I'd grown to hate, the look of defeat. I was stirring pasta sauce at the stove when he set his keys down with a dull clink. He didn't even have the decency to say it right away. Instead, he rubbed the back of his neck and sighed. "They're expecting us," he mumbled. My stomach dropped. I set the spoon down slowly. "What?" I asked, voice low and flat. He glanced at me briefly, then looked away. "Mom's already made the arrangements. They're doing Christmas Eve at their place. She's really looking forward to it." I stared at him. "You promised," I said, my voice barely above a whisper. He shifted his weight. "I know, but..." I slammed the lid on the pot. "You promised," I repeated, my voice shaking. He gave me the same tired speech I'd heard before. Mom cried. She said she doesn't know how many Christmases she'll have left. She feels like she's losing us. Their family too. I didn't say another word. I just turned off the stove, walked to the bedroom and cried in the shower for 20 minutes, biting my knuckles so he wouldn't hear me. That was when I decided, never again. In February, while Connor was at work, I sat at my laptop and made a decision I didn't intend to reverse. I booked 2 first-class tickets to Italy for Thanksgiving. Positano, to be exact. I didn't care how much it cost. $12,000. The flights, the private villa overlooking the sea, the cooking classes, the vineyard tours, the sunset yacht ride. I booked it all. And I didn't tell his parents. Not a word. I waited until 3 weeks before the flight. We were at some overhyped steakhouse with Elaine and Martin. The waiter had just topped off my wine glass when Elaine turned to me with her customary smirk. "So," she asked, "what time are you two coming over for Thanksgiving dinner?" I took a slow sip of wine and "Oh," I said, "we won't be here." Elaine blinked, confused. I savored the next words. "We're spending Thanksgiving in Italy." There was a long, heavy pause, the kind that caked the air from the table. Elaine's fork clattered to her plate. "In Italy?" she repeated slowly. Her voice pinched. Martin lowered his glass, eyes narrowing. "Since when?" I didn't blink. "Since I booked it," Months ago. Elaine's face was drained of color. You didn't tell us? She whispered. Nope. Martin's eyes turned cold. You're just gonna leave the family on a holiday? Like we're nothing? Elaine's lip trembled. Her eyes were glossy with calculated tears, but I didn't care. I didn't look at Connor. I didn't need to. For the first time, he didn't object. But then came the airport scene. As we rolled our luggage through JFK, I heard Elaine's voice, high-pitched and trembling. Connor! And there they were, standing in the middle of the terminal. Uninvited. Elaine sobbing, mascara streaking down her cheeks, Martin glaring, fist clenched. People stared. Phones came out. Elaine clutched Connor's sleeve with trembling fingers, her nails digging in. You owe us, Connor, she shrieked, her voice cracked with rage. And the cameras kept rolling. The airport terminal felt smaller by the second. My breath caught in my throat as the low hum of baggage carts and overhead announcements blurred into the background noise of my pounding pulse. The bright, sterile light above us seemed to cast a cruel spotlight on the scene unfolding. A grown woman sobbing, a man shouting, and strangers watching with their phones raised. Connor's fingers twitched at his side, knuckles pale from the pressure of his clenched fist. I could feel the weight of his hesitation, and it made me want to scream. For a split second, I thought he might cave, that he'd glance at his mother's tear-streaked face, his father's scowl, and let them guilt him into submission. Again, I stared at him, silently willing him. Don't you dare. But Elaine knew exactly what she was doing. Her breath hitched with dramatic shudders, and she clutched Connor's sleeve with trembling fingers, her knuckles white from the force of it. Don't do this, baby. Please. Her voice was thin and broken, just loud enough for the growing crowd to hear. The strategic use of baby made my stomach twist. She hadn't called him that since we were dating, back when she was still pretending to be sweet and welcoming to me. Now, it was a weaponized endearment. A not-so-subtle reminder that she had known him first, loved him first. I watched as her nails dug into his arm, her face red and wet with streaked mascara. She was trembling, deliberately trembling. Her voice cracked on cue. Oscar-worthy. Connor, we're your family, she sobbed. Her voice split the air, shrill and trembling. I saw people stop in their tracks. A man by the check-in kiosk glanced over. A woman with a stroller slowed, her brows drawn in mild concern. I knew what it looked like. From the outside, it must have seemed like we were abandoning two elderly parents on a holiday, cold and heartless, walking away from their tears with our luggage and privileged first-class tickets in hand. That was the performance Elaine was going for, and she was nailing it. Martin's voice was different. Cold, flat, rage simmering just below the surface. He stepped closer to me, too close, his face mere inches from mine. This is all you? His voice was low and pointed, meant only for me. His breath smelled like stale coffee, and I could feel the heat of it against my cheek. You turned him against us, he seethed, his eyes narrowed with disgust. I could feel the way Connor stiffened beside me, his hand tightened around the luggage handle, his knuckles bone white. But he didn't speak. He didn't defend me. He just stood there, silent and motionless, eyes on the floor, as if he were watching himself from far away, too paralyzed to act. And that was what made the rage bloom in my chest. Not Elaine's tears, not Martin's fury, but Connor's deafening silence. Elaine's sobs turned to wails, gaining volume and intensity with each trembling breath. We raised you, Connor, she cried. Her voice was high and reedy, cracking just enough to sound authentic. I carried you for 9 months, she gasped. 9 months, she screamed, and that was when I saw the first phone flash. The guy at the boarding gate raised his phone a little higher, angling it toward us. Another woman subtly tucked her hair behind her ear and tilted her camera just slightly. They were filming, recording it all, the hysterical mother, the stoic father, and me, the villain. I could feel the heat rising behind my eyes, that familiar tightening in my throat, the kind that meant I was seconds away from crying, but I didn't. I refused. Instead, I locked eyes with Connor. My voice was low, sharp, and measured to a blade's edge. Get on the plane. Martin's voice cut through my words. You're breaking her heart, Connor, he snapped. His voice was gruff and biting, the same voice I'd seen him use when he scolded their family dog, like Connor was disobedient. Elaine clutched his sleeve tighter. Her nails dug into his skin, red marks already forming. Please, baby, please. And I saw it, that flicker of guilt in his eyes, that same look he always had when they reeled him back in, the same look that had ruined every holiday for years. And I felt something snap inside me. I turned toward Elaine, my voice low and firm. Let him go. The words left my mouth, slow and deliberate, barely louder than a whisper. But she heard me. Her eyes widened slightly, as though she were startled that I had spoken at all. Her fingers loosened on Connor's sleeve for just a fraction of a second. And that was all I needed. I took one step forward and gripped Connor's wrist. Firm, unyielding. I could feel his pulse, rapid beneath my fingers. He looked at me, blinking rapidly, and for once, he didn't wince at the firmness of my grip. He just stared. He inflicted, helpless, and afraid. We're leaving, I said, my voice steady but ice cold. Elaine let out a fresh wail, her hand flying to her chest, as though she were physically pained by my words. Connor, she screamed. Her voice cracked dramatically, splintering into a heart-wrenching sob, her legs buckled slightly. Just enough to make it look real, but not enough to actually fall. She gripped Martin's arm, performing her grief perfectly. I stared straight ahead. I didn't look at her, not once. And then came the final blow. As we walked away, Connor trembling slightly and me gripping his wrist like a lifeline, I heard Martin's voice boom behind us. Sharp. Cruel. "You'll regret this, Connor," he roared, his voice echoing through the terminal. "You'll be back. You always come back." I heard the sound of a phone shutter. Click. Another. Click. People recording. Phones held up. The flashes catch every grimace on Elaine's face. Every fleck of spit from Martin's lips, as he shouted, every moment of their carefully choreographed heartbreak. We didn't look back. We made it to the gate. The doors closed behind us. The noise of the terminal fell away. I could feel Connor trembling faintly beneath my hand. I turned toward him, my voice softer now, breathless. "Are you okay?" He nodded, but didn't speak. He just stared ahead. And I knew this wasn't over. We sat in silence for the first hour of the flight. The plane hummed with the low, steady drone of the engines. The occasional clink of glasses from the first-class cabin barely registering over the dull throb in my head. The adrenaline was still coursing through my veins, making my fingers tremble slightly every time I reached for my wine glass. I could still feel the heat of Martin's breath on my face, still hear Elaine's wail echoing faintly in my ears. Connor sat stiffly beside me, his body turned slightly toward the window. He hadn't spoken since we boarded. His face was pale, jaw clenched tight, and I could see the tension in his shoulders, the rigid line of his neck. His hand was still resting on the armrest, and I noticed the faint crescent-shaped indents, where Elaine's nails had dug into his skin. I should have felt relieved. We had made it onto the plane. The nightmare scene was behind us, but instead I felt this slow, gnawing dread blooming in my chest, because I knew that silence. I'd heard it before. That was the sound of Connor retreating into himself. I took a slow breath and forced my voice to be steady. "Do you want some water?" I asked softly, almost tentative. He didn't look at me. He stared out the window, at the expanse of clouds below, his knuckles pale and unmoving against the armrest. Then he shook his head slightly. That was it. Just a tiny hollow gesture. No words. Just the empty weight of his silence. I let it be. I turned toward my own window, resting my forehead lightly against the cool surface, watching the faint blush of pink and orange bleed across the horizon. The sun was beginning to set over the Atlantic, casting a golden haze on the surface of the water far below. I watched the faint glimmer of a distant coastline come into view, and I forced myself to breathe. We were leaving. We were finally leaving. I closed my eyes and tried to let that thought soothe me. But I couldn't stop seeing Elaine's face, the streaks of mascara, the trembling lips, the exaggerated stumble into Martin's arms. So calculated, so flawless, and yet so convincing. Somewhere over the ocean, Connor finally spoke. His voice was low and gravelly, barely louder than a breath. "Do you think I'm a bad son?" I turned slowly, blinking in disbelief. The question was so faint, so fragile, I wasn't even sure I had heard him right at first. I stared at him. His eyes were still on the window, glazed and unfocused, his reflection barely visible in the glass. There was no anger in his voice, no bite, just a quiet, aching uncertainty. The lump in my throat tightened. I opened my mouth, but the words caught. I reached for his hand instead, my fingers brushing lightly over the tender, nail-bitten half-moons his mother had left behind. "Connor," I whispered. He exhaled shakily, finally turning toward me. His eyes were red-rimmed, but dry. He gave me a faint, bitter smile. "They're probably still at the airport," he murmured hoarsely, crying to some poor security guard. I huffed out a weak breath, something close to a laugh, but not quite. And just like that, the tension broke slightly. Just for a second. He rubbed his palm slowly over his jaw, then turned back toward the window. His voice was still hoarse when he spoke again. "They're never going to forgive me." I didn't respond right away. I just watched him, my fingers still lightly tracing the edge of his wrist. I could feel the slight tremor beneath his skin. He was holding it in, locking it all away. "Maybe not," I finally said softly. I meant it to be reassuring, but the words hung in the space between us, heavy and brittle. His throat bobbed slightly as he swallowed. He nodded, slowly, and then he turned away again. Back to the window, back to the clouds, back into himself. The villa in Positano was breathtaking, but it was impossibly quiet when we arrived. The house sat perched on a rocky cliffside, overlooking the expanse of the deep blue Tyrrhenian Sea. The terracotta roof gleamed in the golden light of late afternoon, and the stone terrace was flanked with lush olive trees and bright bursts of bougainvillea. The place was immaculate. White linen curtains billowed softly in the salty sea breeze. The scent of fresh lemon blossoms lingered faintly in the air. The villa's infinity pool glimmered under the sun, its surface so still that it looked like glass suspended over the sea. It was perfect. Exactly as I had imagined it, and yet, I felt nothing. Connor stood near the open balcony doors, his hands loosely resting on the railing. He didn't say a word, just stared out at the sea in front of him, face blank. I watched his shoulders rise and fall with each slow, measured breath. I set my bag down quietly and crossed the room, stepping onto the balcony beside him. The evening sun was low on the horizon now, spilling long golden ribbons across the sea, but his eyes stayed distant. For a long moment, Neither of us spoke. We just stood there, side by side, listening to the sound of the distant waves below, the faint rustle of olive leaves in the breeze, and the occasional far-off laughter from the village below. That night, we barely spoke. We sat at the small marble table on the terrace, a bottle of white wine between us, mostly untouched. Connor picked at his food without tasting it. I tried. I asked him about the menu at the vineyard we had planned to visit the next day. I brought up the cooking class I had been excited for, the boat tour I booked. But he only gave me faint, distracted nods. At one point I reached across the table and brushed my fingertips lightly against his hand. He flinched, and I felt it, that heavy ache in my chest, the sharp sting behind my eyes, because I knew exactly where his mind was, back at JFK with them, because even though we were here, he wasn't, not really. The next morning, I woke to the sound of ocean waves and the faint hum of his voice. Connor was out on the balcony, his back to me, his phone pressed to his ear. I froze. I could feel my pulse in my throat. His voice was low and flat, but I didn't have to hear the words to know who he's talking to.
Elaine.
I sat up slowly, barefoot and silent, listening. He was quiet for a long time, just making small empty sounds of agreement every so often, and then, barely above a whisper, I heard him say, "I'm sorry, Mom." I squeezed my eyes shut, feeling the sharp sting behind my temples. I inhaled slowly. In, out, trying to keep my breathing steady. I waited, fingernails digging into my palms, fighting the urge to scream. When he finally hung up, he didn't turn around. He just stood there, staring out at the sea again. And for the first time, I wondered if he was ever really going to leave them behind. The next few days blurred into a strange, hollow routine. The sun was fiercely golden over the cliffs of Positano, spilling ribbons of heat across the rooftops and making the sea sparkle like a sheet of diamonds. The scent of lemons and salt clung to the air. Tourists in linen shirts and wide-brimmed hats meandered through the stone-paved streets, laughing easily, stopping to buy trinkets and gelato. But inside the villa, the silence between Connor and me was deafening. I had imagined so many things for this trip. The two of us walking hand in hand along the shoreline, sharing bottles of wine on the terrace, and getting tipsy enough to stumble into the infinity pool fully clothed. I pictured us watching the sunset from the yacht, leaning against him with my head on his shoulder, the way I used to. I imagined joy, connection, but instead I felt like I was traveling with a ghost. We went to Vitri Solmare one afternoon, stopping at a tiny, sunlit cafe near the port. It should have been idyllic. An old Italian man, with weathered hands, brought us bruschetta and 2 glasses of limoncello. The faint scent of basil and olive oil lingered in the warm breeze. The place was perfect. But as we sat at the little iron bistro table, Connor was hunched over his phone. Again, I stared at my glass, watching the condensation bead, and drip slowly down the side. I already knew who he was texting. He didn't try to hide it anymore. He didn't have to. He kept the screen tilted slightly toward himself, but I caught enough glimpses. Messages from her words flashing against the screen like little hooks, reeling him in. "We miss you so much. Your father isn't sleeping. Thanksgiving was awful without you." And the dagger. "The house feels empty without my baby." I stared at him from across the table, watching him slip further and further away, back into their grasp. He didn't even look at me. Not once. The night before the cooking class, he was still on his phone when I walked out of the shower. I stood by the balcony door, my damp hair clinging to my shoulders, watching him. He was sitting on the edge of the bed, barefoot and slouched, the screen lighting up his face, scrolling, text, reading. His fingers moved slowly across the screen, and every now and then I heard the faint ping of another message coming through. I didn't speak. I didn't ask him what they were saying. I didn't want to hear it. Instead, I stood there for a long time, barefoot and dripping, and stared at the man I no longer recognized. The next morning, I woke up alone. I blinked blearily at the crumpled sheets beside me, running my hand over the still warm spot where he had been sleeping. I sat up slowly, heart thudding faintly in my chest. The sound of low voices drifted in from the balcony. I slipped out of bed, moving slowly toward the door. And there he was, standing barefoot in his pajama pants, phone pressed to his ear. His voice was low and heavy with sleep, but there was no mistaking it. He was talking to her. "No, Mom. I know, he murmured. "I'll call again tomorrow. I promise." I took a step back, feeling my chest tighten, and suddenly, I saw it all so clearly. He was never going to leave them, no matter what I did. No matter how far we traveled. I could have flown him to the edge of the world, and he still would have carried them with him, because they were always with him. On the other end of the phone. In every text. In every guilty glance. In his blood. And in that moment, I realized something. I was done. Not just with his parents. Not just with the guilt and the games and the tears. I was done with him. Done chasing him. Done fighting a battle I could never win. I didn't say anything when he came back inside. I just watched him move around the room, grabbing his things, a towel, a shirt, his watch, completely oblivious to the fact that I had just made the cleanest decision of my life. He kissed the top of my head absent-mindedly as he walked by, his phone still in his hand. "You want coffee?" he asked lightly, as if nothing had happened, as if he hadn't just been whispering promises into his mother's ear. I nodded. Sure. Over the next 2 days, I didn't argue with him. I didn't demand explanations. I didn't tell him I was hurt. Instead, I smiled sweetly. I took his hand in mine as we walked through the little villages. I let him pick the wine at dinner. I held his arm when we strolled along the cliffside paths, brushing my fingers softly over his wrist. I even kissed him slowly on the balcony as the sun dipped below the water, and he smiled, clueless. On the morning of our departure, I woke up early. I showered, dressed, and packed my things while he was still sleeping. I took my carry-on and passport but left my suitcase open on the bed. I walked out onto the terrace one last time, taking a slow breath of the salty morning air, letting the early sun warm my face. And then I did it. I quietly took his phone from the nightstand. I opened his text thread with Elaine and hit select all. Then with a slow, deliberate swipe, I forwarded every single message to my own phone. All of it. The guilt trips, the manipulation, the crocodile tears, all in stark black and white. I set his phone back down, grabbed my bag, and walked out the door. I didn't leave a note. By the time he woke up, I was already gone. At the airport. On a plane. Flying home alone. By the time he realized what I had done, it was already too late. When I landed, I sent the messages to his siblings, his aunts, his uncles, to every single person who had ever been pulled into the theatrics. No explanation, just the pure, unfiltered truth of his mother's relentless guilt trips and his father's cold, cruel words. And then I sat back and watched it all unravel. The messages spread like wildfire. I didn't have to say a word. Their own words spoke louder than I ever could. A week later, Connor called me, twice. I let it go to voicemail both times. He sent a text, "I'm so sorry, can we talk?" I stared at the screen for a moment. Then, without a word, I blocked his number. The last I heard, Elaine and Martin were getting the cold shoulder from nearly everyone in their family. They had finally been exposed for the manipulators they were, and their own words had done them in. No screaming, no violence, just the simple weight of truth. And Connor, I never heard from him again, and I never looked back.
Hey everyone, want to win 4 NBC Palm Springs VIP tickets to watch entertainment icons Frankie Valli and the Four Seasons? Then click the link. The concert is Friday, November 8th at the Special Events Center at Fantasy Springs Resort.
You can win 4 NBC tickets to watch Frankie Valli and the Four Seasons. It's simple. Just click the link, scroll to the cool page, then enter for your chance to win 4 tickets and watch the show from the NBC Palm Springs seats at Fantasy Springs Resort.
Again, 4 NBC Palm Springs VIP tickets to watch Frankie Valli and the Four Seasons can be yours, so click the link. Good luck!